Hello everyone, this is the Paint Palette. Today I'm going to be reacting to another one of Basic Logic's terrible tier lists. That's what we're going to call them, the terrible tier list series. He is deciding to debunk democracy this time, which is almost as dumb as debunking racial egalitarianism. And so I have decided to see what exactly his arguments are and just jump into it, because as a big history buff, even though I don't have a degree, I have my own input, and I think he is wrong to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. So let's get into it.
The idea that the average person nowadays should have the right to an opinion is absurd. They'd be much happier working in the fields or watching reality TV. Instead, their feelings get electrified and weaponized by mass media, which specializes not in fact-finding or logic, but rather on ways to make the masses parrot them for political power.
This is a really unfair way to think about the larger public, because instead of trying to motivate people to actually improve themselves mentally for the time that they need to vote, he's just disparaging them. And he must also realize that a lot of people who do this don't vote. So his problem is also kind of a silly one, because, well, if someone doesn't care enough to learn, they probably don't care enough to vote. You have to incentivize people to care enough to learn. And throwing tomatoes at them for just being dumb NPCs is not helping.
Of course, saying this might as well be blasphemy by modern standards, which treats democracy as a god to be worshipped.
I don't have this opinion because democracy is a god. I doubt anyone has it because democracy is their god. It is because democracy is probably the best we are going to get. And considering the alternatives, I feel very confident in saying that.
As an unassailable good that all people would prosper under, and should be forcefully imposed upon every society, no matter how repeatedly disastrous the outcomes. Therefore,
unless someone is under the age of 10, I think people understand that how democracy is handled in one country should be different from how it is handled in another. And of course, if we come at this from a Hobbesian perspective, we would understand exactly why that is. Some countries have yet to fully solidify their government's control over the territory they claim to rule. And if they can't at least do that, then of course they won't be able to educate their populace towards being a strongly aware enough society to justify being democratic. If they still vote against maintaining a democratic republic, then that is probably their choice. But they should at least have the chance.
in this video, I'll be ranking and debunking all arguments for democracy.
Strong, even if I disagree. Which, of course, means that nothing can sway him in towards the idea that democracy for all within a society that considers itself a democracy is good. Or that, rather, it is at least the least wicked option.
And putting them on a tier list. And if you enjoyed, consider subscribing. It helps the channel. But first, a quick clarification. In seriousness, I'm not fully opposed to democracy itself.
Not fully opposed to democracy. He's fine with it, as long as his side gets voted in. With whatever side that is, of course. And considering he aligns himself more closely with the Nuremberg laws than anything in the Bible that he claims to take seriously, I have no interest in what he claims democracy should look like if he were to set it up. Because ultimately it would just become, well, its own form of dictatorship.
Rather, I am opposed to democracy for our modern societies, because voting is a...
And, of course, he's an elitist, which is extremely arrogant. And, of course, does not take into account the fact that taking away the vote from, let's say, American society, even though he claims to be from Europe, if he was an American citizen, then taking away the vote means taking it away from him too. And whatever aristocracy, oligarchy, or even monarch or dictator might come to power is one that will probably not align with his views, and one he will suffer for having helped strip democracy away from him.
Privilege, one that has to be earned and upheld by a people who are able to handle the responsibility of it. As John Adams, a founding father and second president of the US, said about the Constitution, it was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. When you look...
And of course, this man is neither moral nor religious, so should he have the vote by John Adams' logic? He essentially shoots himself in the foot here.
In our modern societies, do the words moral and religious come to mind? If not, then you have a founding father affirming that the Constitution is invalid.
No, that is not the implication. And considering all the rights within the Constitution that are intended to stay with the population to prevent them from being oppressed, not necessarily to empower them, the Constitution would still be intended to apply by the Founding Fathers even to our society. Since one should still be entitled to know what they're being put on trial for if they're convicted of a crime and brought before a judge. That's an example. I believe should set the stage for just how poor of an argument this is. Because stripping away someone's right to a fair trial is something I don't believe John Adams would have given a thumbs up to.
Well, let's get started. Consent of the governed. This argument claims that democracy through voting is a uniquely fair form of governance, as it acquires the consent of those it rules over, which is absolute cope. If that were the case, you wouldn't need law enforcement now, would you? People would just consent to your instructions.
Consenting to the government you live under is different from consenting to the laws. You can want your government to change its laws, or you can completely disregard the laws, and that's where criminals come from. They disregard the law. And, of course, confusing the two is mangling something that Hobbes himself says about the state of nature. He says that if the state of nature among humans were sufficient for men to flourish mostly in peace, then there would be no need for the government. But since humans in a state of nature are in a state of war of all against all, then they need a government, and they need a system of laws specifically to keep them from falling into either complete disorder or at least conquest by some other government, assuming their society cares about that. And a democratic government, which he claims is just coercion by the majority, that's a flawed argument, simply because in a democracy, we agree to go along with what the majority of the public vote for, at least those in the public who can vote. By this argument, if children aren't allowed to vote, then it's not fair because they're being coerced by the public. And we directly consent to the outcome of a democracy by engaging in voting, because we understand that even if our side loses, we will be treated fairly by the other side simply because we are giving them an equally fair chance that they are giving us. And this is a far stronger compromise that is built upon consent of the governed. And so democracy upholds consent of the governed in a way that it is harder to say other forms of governments are capable of doing to the same strong degree.
Consent and governance are contradictory by definition. Democratic states are still a form of organized coercion. The only difference is that coercion is justified by the support of the mob.
And that's dishonest. It's like, If you want to call it coercion, you can, but it is a coercion that is being consented to, since this coercion is also what is enforcing the laws that you live under.
This tier. Wisdom of the crowds. This is the belief that the majority opinion is often the correct opinion. Therefore,
It's more that the wisdom of the crowds is the idea that if you ask a million people their opinion on this one thing, you will tend to come closer to the correct answer than you might if you asked just one of them, since they will tend to lean towards what is probably the rational answer, since they either have their self-interest to consider, or if nothing else, at least someone else's self-interest to consider. And the idea that the majority of society would vote for something that will destroy society knowingly is unfair. It's not entirely wrong, but it is still unfair, because it is a very weak straw man of democracy.
Everyone vote on policy. It ignores that most opinions are redundant. In cases of ignorance, a person, made to express a preference, will parrot whatever position he has already heard.
The problem with this argument is there will be people who will parrot the correct opinion according to him too. And so this problem specifically would balance itself out under normal circumstances.
This means in practice, wisdom of the crowds actually means wisdom of the mass media oligarchs, which is why the media has effectively become a fourth branch of government. In fact,
and that is a problem. However, that is slowly becoming less and less of a problem, simply because people understand that more and more so in today's society, and they are trying to pull themselves away from that. People are not as dumb as he thinks, and so they will try to handle such a thing as democracy as properly as possible, as far as a massive crowd of people could do it.
Voters are actually rationally ignorant, as in the system is set up in such a way that being ignorant is the rational choice. Because
that might be the case for today, but at the same time, if someone chooses to be ignorant, then they probably also don't vote. Simply because if it's not worth their time to learn, it's even less worth their time to go out and actually vote. And, well, I myself don't vote simply because I would rather wait until I've served in the military to vote. That is simply my preference, and I don't want to enforce that on someone else.
Becoming well-versed in politics is difficult work, and one vote will never sway an election.
That attitude is also a problem, because if everyone has that attitude, then of course you're going to get a bunch of morons doing all the voting. So you have to teach people to care about learning, education, and properly understanding their responsibility as citizens in order for them to care about swaying society in one direction or another for the right reasons. This consistent negative attitude essentially becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if it becomes popular enough. And he is helping it to become popular, which I think is probably one of the most ugly parts of this video and the worst part of this argument.
Therefore, the incentive for becoming well-informed prior to voting is effectively zero. Instead, voters will vote for whatever they...
I mean, it's effectively zero for one person, but for a whole crowd of people, they do have to... It is technically larger because it accumulates with population. And if everyone knows that it accumulates with population, then they will be more incentivized to learn what would be best to vote for, so that the whole crowd, with understanding of their power as the crowd, can vote properly.
Feel like. And politicians know this, which is why they appeal to emotion, not reason. Get free stuff now, who cares how we'll pay for it? Specialized decision makers, such as in aristocracies or monarchies, don't have this.
The problem is that specialized decision makers like that can fall into oligarchy, or worse. You can get a king like Caligula. Would you prefer Caligula over the American voting system? I don't think so. And the same would be true of the Roman Republic, since it was effectively an aristocratic oligarchy. And that ultimately led down to the path of several civil wars. And that was largely because they were too selfish to actually govern this massive empire properly. And the more power you concentrate in a smaller amount of hands, the more their personal flaws will harm the body that you are trying to govern. And democracy makes this less of a problem. It doesn't make it non-existent, but it makes it much less of a problem than it would be with an absolute monarch or an aristocracy.
Issue, and are actually better aligned with the long-term survival of their nation, because it is their nation. To get the
I feel like Crassus and Pompey would like to have a word with you.
rationally ignorant masses involved in decision-making is to make decision-making a circus decided by showmanship. NPC tier. It's the worst form of government, except for all others. This quote from Winston Churchill is a cute slogan, but historically illiterate. It was arguably true during Churchill's time. It was not true throughout the centuries. In fact,
well, it wasn't true up until probably the 1500s, or maybe a century earlier, because the problem people had until then was mass literacy wasn't a big thing until the 1500s in Europe. When mass literacy was a thing, people wanted democracy because they wanted to have a say in how their governments behaved, since their governments behaving without the consent of the governed could ultimately lead to the worst outcomes. And we saw several examples of that in Europe. We can't just shrug that off because democracy is having the equivalent of an ear infection today.
democracies often devolve into mob rule and cause the downfall of their own societies.
I mean, that happened in Greece and Rome, and it happened once in France because their societies either weren't ready for full democracy, or they had oligarchies that were already prepared, at least in terms of position, to influence and hijack this potential democracy. Alcibiades broke Athenian democracy in his own way, not because the people were complete morons who didn't think when they voted for him. It was because he was corrupt. And he was ultimately revealed to be the scumbag that people should have seen him as earlier.
In such a way that even a tyrannical dictatorship would have been preferable.
There is no government. I would prefer any ancient government over the Third Reich. And the idea that such an ugly government could be preferred over the Roman Republic or even the Holy Roman Empire is probably one of the most evil deceptions you can try to lead people towards, considering the abomination and the atrocities committed by the Third Reich.
It's a pattern of history stretching back to the ancient Greeks that when a populace finds out they can vote themselves gifts from the national treasury as welfare, they do so, unable to stop until their nation...
The failure of Athens was not because of that. It was because they were conquered, first by the Macedonians, and then later on by the Romans. And going up against Rome, of course Athens was going to lose. That's not quite coughing baby versus hydrogen bomb, but the dynamic was not in Athens' favor.
...goes bankrupt. Not only that, when a discovery is made, politics devolves into which politician is willing to sell the future of their nation the most to give the people now as much as possible.
This is an argument that basically depends on all democracies falling into the same cultural rut that the Western world has. And the problem is that culture does not freeze at any one point in time, and it does not stay permanently broken once it is broken. It can recover, and people can change their minds about what they want their government to do. And it is a very poor excuse to try and argue against the people having a right to vote. Just because they may vote against their own interests at some point does not mean that you should throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Once this threshold is crossed, I haven't found examples in history of people being able to stop it before it's too late. It's during these periods that de facto monarchies appear to take the reins and try to save the nation if possible. NPC tier. One person, one vote is fair. No, it's not. Look at this person. Now look at this person. In what world is it fair that their vote weighs the same?
It is not fair that they are respected equally by different parts of the public, but in a court of law, it is fair that both of them have one vote, simply because, well, one person having one vote is far better than rolling the dice on giving some part of the population no votes at all. Because if you do that in a democracy, you are breaking the social contract. And breaking the social contract is begging for a rebellion. And a rebellion would break the government itself.
One person, one vote isn't fair. It's equal.
And it is better that we keep things legally equal for everyone, because one person, one vote is a symbol of the compromise that everyone is also, at least in theory, equal under the law. Now, while that might not be true in practice in some cases, that is the ideal we strive towards, and we have to actively strive towards it in a society where one person has one vote. If one person has two votes or one person has no votes, then equality under the law is thrown out the window. And in a society with no equality under the law, then taking the law seriously is much less important to those with the power to ignore it. Everyone has to have equal voting power for the members of the elites to be held accountable in as proper a manner as possible. We cannot run to an aristocracy to solve all our problems for us, because if we set the precedent of giving up our vote, we set the precedent of losing all our other rights. And I have no interest in that.
But equality is a farce. No two people are equal.
Of course, no two people are equal. That's like saying no two atoms in the universe are in the same place at once.
Political system around a lie to make underperforming kids feel better about themselves in kindergarten will not yield positive results. At this tier, elections replace the violent power struggles. This is true. One of the main advantages of democracies.
This is true in theory, but it is an extreme oversimplification. Well, from a Hobbesian perspective, that is a democracy. One of the benefits of democracy is replacing a violent power struggle. That is also done with a kingdom or aristocracy from Hobbes' perspective. But what the election does for society, in addition to making power struggles, at least in theory, unnecessary, it makes them undesirable, because everyone understands that if their votes are all equal under the law, and that the other side will respectfully concede if they win, whether or not, assuming they lose the vote, rather, or they will treat the losers of the election with grace if they themselves win, then the society is much stronger for it, because they see this decent behavior in relation to what is not just a transition of power, but a show of fairness, a show of good faith. And that is what is the most important about democracy in relation to transitioning from one authority figure to the other. In the United States case, the president. It is a show of good faith every time one president steps down and accepts the results against him, or simply steps down because his second term is over. We cannot throw out a sign of good faith simply because it is not in our favor.
Is that should an old elite lose support, they can have a peaceful and orderly transition of power. In this, votes are promises of force. Each side is measuring
No, they are promises of good faith, not force.
support, and assumes the side with the most support would win a civil war. So instead of
This is a very dark and disturbing way to think about democracy.
fighting it out, the loser concedes. The issue comes when the votes stop representing actual force. When the weak, or those who don't have a stake in society, vote, it's a deception. Because should a civil war happen, they won't fight.
There is no one who does not have a stake in society, because even those who technically weigh society down depend on the law being just as fair towards them as it is towards someone else. Someone, let's say, who is unable to work still has a stake in society being equal, because maybe either his children or grandchildren will be able to produce something for society. And so he should be treated equally by the law, simply because, like I've said before several times, to set a different precedent would be far worse for society. And one must also ask the question, what if someone has served in the military and has become disabled and are unable to be productive to society after that? Are they suddenly stripped of their votes simply because they can no longer work and thus no longer contribute in terms of paying taxes? That would be extremely unfair, considering what they had sacrificed for the country. And we must understand that so long as everyone is invested in the rule of law, and everyone is invested in the rule of law in a democracy where one person has one vote, there is nobody who is not invested in the well-being of society. They may not properly understand they are invested in it, but they are invested in it nonetheless.
When this deception is exposed, the incentives change, and actually increases the likelihood of violence. Take, for example, a situation where Party A has the support of a well-armed and motivated minority of about 45%. Meanwhile, Party B has a cowardly or apathetic majority of about 55%. In such a system, Party B...
This is an apples to oranges comparison, because the previous situation he proposes is one where the society has a consistent feeling of good faith towards their democratic elections and is willing to accept the result no matter what. But the moment you bring force into this, you take away that assumption. This is not an election done in good faith.
will always win elections, but Party A will always win civil wars. So how?
And a civil war should not matter in an election between two sides if the election is being done in good faith. If it is not being done in good faith, then something has gone severely wrong way before this specific election.
Long until Party A decides enough is enough. But it's actually worse than that, because when power struggles happen in monarchies or aristocracies, that's a dispute between the elites in a nation, not the people.
It may not be a dispute between the people, but it will end up involving them nonetheless. The English Civil War and American Civil War were both, I believe, the deadliest wars on their respective homeland soil. The dispute between the government, between the Union and the Confederacy, as to its right to secede in the name of slavery, still involved the deaths of over 500,000 Americans, either by disease or something else. And while one may claim that was an aristocratic dispute, if they are really that dedicated to discounting democracy, they cannot discount those deaths. Those men died in the name of preserving either a united government or, in the South's case, a form of society that cruelly subjugated one people beneath another in the name of wealth. And ultimately, there is no excuse to discount those who die in a civil war simply because the people directing a civil war are not the public, but the elites.
The people may suffer, but rarely are they fully mobilized to kill their own countrymen.
Wrong again. The English Civil War saw England, Scotland, and Ireland, to a degree, be mostly mobilized in order to put down the royalist movement. And in the end, the English aristocracy under Cromwell became, well, almost as authoritarian, if not more, than under Charles I. Although that is a hard argument to make, given Charles I wanted to be an absolute monarch.
On the other hand, in a democracy with mass mobilization and ideological warfare, it becomes
the only two democracies where the population could, in theory, snap its fingers and be mass mobilized instantly are Switzerland and the United States, largely because of the mass gun ownership there. The other countries in Europe would probably take a while to actually mass mobilize for a civil war, although they would still suffer under such civil wars. And voting does not incentivize civil wars. If the population has been voting and going along with the votes for a long enough time, then winning the vote is a sign of good faith. Well, conceding to whoever wins the vote is a sign of good faith, and does not incentivize civil wars unless there is a problem in society that has been ignored to the point that a civil war becomes the only way to release the pressure on this ideological valve.
a full-blown civil war, with sometimes even regular families getting forced into opposite sides. Strong tier though, because it's true as long as the vote is respectable. Democracies protect liberties better. No, they don't. They just waste time trying to justify the erasure of liberties to pretend like they care. Take the civil rights.
Does he truly believe someone like Charles I would have tried to protect his liberties more than the American Constitution would? I highly doubt it.
Act, for example, it was supposed to end racism. In practice, it ended freedom of association. The only one who can protect your personal liberty is you. Your state.
This is, I believe, the only time he has provided a full example, one that can actually be verified. And yes, the ending, not the ending, but rather the weakening of freedom of association ended up being a bad thing in the long run. However, it was seemingly the best option at the time to prevent, well, mass riots. Well, those were already happening, but things from getting even worse than they already were in the South. And we also have to consider that if we are committed enough to our liberties, we may eventually be able to regain freedom of association. If people can so easily vote for free stuff, as he says, how can they not vote for freedom of association?
Doesn't do it, and if anything, it's a constant threat to it, as Europe is now learning the hard way. In fact,
well, a democratic state may be a threat to it, but something But any other kind of government is a threat to it even more. Simply because in a non-democratic society or government, the elites there have no incentive to pay attention to the desires of the citizens or what they actually need. Is Saudi Arabia a better government than the United States? No. Its people are still starving, and they still live under a mostly totalitarian government. And there is no way at the moment that their people can get their liberties back. Simply because if someone did try, they would eventually just make themselves the new oligarchs. And that is ultimately the problem with getting rid of democracy. Simply because if you lose it, you cannot get it back. And throwing away one of your rights, like I said before, only sets the precedent for getting rid of the rest of them. And getting rid of your right to vote is ultimately far worse than temporarily losing freedom of association.
I'd argue democracies care about your liberties even less than monarchies or aristocracies.
I want to see that guy live in North Korea and say that. North Korea is not a democratic state. It behaves effectively like a monarchy. And it's not protecting anyone's rights there. The people are constantly trying to flee North Korea within, even though it may as well be impossible under most circumstances.
You, having some liberties, is useful, as you can be a productive citizen. But a politician is only incentivized to care about your utility for however long his term is. A monarch, on the other hand, has to think long-term. He needs to consider your lifelong productivity and your ability...
Actually, he doesn't have to think long-term. He only cares about what keeps him in power. And there are several examples of monarchs that behave like complete morons because they don't really care about what their society needs or wants. They care about keeping themselves in power. And centralizing power just makes that problem worse.
to pass on your skills to future generations, for the good of his country and his heirs. NPC tier.
There is no argument for enlightened absolutism that will prevent there from being someone like Caligula.
Democracies are richer. Correlation is not causation.
This is an oversimplification. It is not that democracies are necessarily richer, it is that it is easier for them to become richer. Simply because they have set all the precedents required to have functional rule of law, good faith in the government, and all these other things necessary for stability. And stability to the point that conducting business in their country is worth more time than it is to conduct in any other country. And in the case of the United States was able to become so much more wealthy than a lot of places in Europe, with the exception of Britain, for the most part, and Germany, largely because it was able to provide that kind of environment. And so, of course, Europe and America have become, through becoming at least somewhat democratic, in the case of Europe, they have made themselves better off for it. And no one can change that. At least, no one can change the history that led up to that. The democracies today that are struggling to pull themselves out of poverty are the ones that are struggling to enforce rule of law. If they can enforce rule of law successfully, then they would probably only need a few decades to catch up with a country like Italy.
Democratic societies are richer, but is the reason for that democracy, or is it something else? Because it's not actually...
I love the subliminal nod to what he thinks the cause actually is. It's like one video he has the guts to say it, and the other he doesn't.
Democracies that are richer, but the West, democracy.
And I don't believe that's necessarily true either. Japan and Korea are not Western countries. They're part of a different civilization, East Asia. And I would probably argue that their people are more civilized than us, simply because when they build democracies, they do extremely well. Of course, that comes with some caveats, because their societies have different desires and ideas from ours, but I would still say that compared to Italy, South Korea is doing, well, at least it was doing a lot better 10 years ago. The problems that South Korea and Japan have are more to do with institutional and societal problems that I believe will show up eventually in every country that is developed enough to have them. And how those will be solved will depend on the society. But of course, that distracts from the actual argument. It is not because they are part of our civilization that these countries have become wealthier. It is because they have established successful rule of law and faith in the decency of the government, that these places are trusted enough to conduct lots and lots of business in and become wealthy through that.
Is not a political hack for wealth, as we've seen from all the times in which we liberated nations, and they ended up worse than before. The reason democracies are richer isn't because of democracy itself, but because it takes a competent, self-reliant people to be able to establish.
And you can't really have that until you establish rule of law. And that is the difficult part of building a functional democracy. Because there are parts of the world where that is just much harder due to other factors that would take too long to explain here. Consolidation just takes time, and I believe it will eventually happen in the parts of the world where it has yet to happen.
For themselves a democracy and survive without outside intervention. You can't force success on people. The law tier. Democracy, just like any governing system, is a tool, not a god. It works for some people, sometimes. Like any tool, if it's not appropriate for the job at hand, it should be replaced with something better suited.
There is no one who can convince me to throw away democracy, simply because I know that if I decide to, I will lose all of my rights with democracy. And I don't believe that he actually takes this seriously. Since if he did, he would understand that he would lose his rights if he were to lose democracy in whatever country he lives in. Getting rid of democracy in a society that has successfully obtained it is the dumbest thing I can imagine any country doing. And there is no excuse to advocate for it. And there is no excuse to advocate for the oppression of others. Just because I have decided that I would rather not vote until I am able to serve in the military and have served in the military does not mean that I believe that decision should be forced on others. That is their choice. If they wish to vote once they're able to, by our current legal standards, that is their choice. It is their liberty. And we should not want to strip other people of their liberties. Simply because if we want to do that, then eventually they will want to do that to us. And that is an ugly precedent we should not set. Anyway, yeah, this has been another terrible tier list video. Sorry about the long-winded rants. But I get so fired up by this. Anyway, stay safe. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And goodbye.